Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning, coming to you tonight from the banks of the Brisbane River. In this city, my hometown, where it has been raining a lot. But all that wet and all that humidity hasn't kept the politicians away, because there are 30 federal seats and crucial Senate spots up for grabs in this state. In 2019, Queensland became a coalition stronghold and a place of broken dreams for Labor. 3 years on, we asked what, if anything, has changed. We're here at Bougainvillea House, overlooking the Story Bridge on the Indigenous lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people. And joining me on the panel today, Indigenous Chair of Creative Industries at the Queensland University of Technology, Wesley Enoch. Good to see you.
Yes.
Well, I'm used to saying Queensland Institute of Technology.
Oh, there you go. That's
QIT.
Yes.
That ages me a little, my old alma mater. Former State Director of the Victorian National Party, crisis management consultant Sally Branson, and also Gold Coast Transplant.
That's right. I'm here representing the GC now.
Fantastic. Living the dream. Company Director, writer and former CEO of the Local Government Association of Queensland, Greg Hallam. Lovely to meet you, Greg.
Thank you.
And former Queensland Deputy Labor Premier and Treasurer Jackie Trad. Nice to see you in person.
Hi, Ellen.
I'll put my teeth back in. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Severe weather systems notwithstanding, Queensland has had the largest population growth in the country over the past year. People like Sally moved here in their thousands, and that trend is set to continue. Queensland's population is expected to grow by 1 million people within 5 years, taking it to 6 million. And it makes Brisbane Australia's fastest growing capital city. So it's a popular place to be for sure. Perhaps that's because there are plenty of jobs and cheaper housing. But the big migration might soon change some of that. Our reporter Stephanie Bolchi has a look.
It's been about 3 weeks since John and his partner moved into their new home in the northern suburbs of Brizzy.
Some of the places we were going to, they were saying they had 70, 80 couples coming through in a day, which blew my mind. We were waiting. Some of them we saw the line and just turned our car around and left.
John's not the only Melburnian wanting a lifestyle change. Most of the people who relocated here in the past year came from New South Wales and Victoria.
In the 90s, certainly, we were going gangbusters, around 50,000 people per year net. But then we really dropped off at the beginning of sort of the 2000s following the GFC, and so this is a bit of an upsurge again. And look, that's also in part due to people staying, so not as many people are leaving Queensland as they were prior to the pandemic.
John would have come sooner, but border closures got in the way. And during that time, the housing situation changed too.
We were looking at, say, 3-bedroom apartments or 3-bedroom townhouses, and then over that 5-6 month period, all of a sudden we lost a bedroom and we were looking at a 2-bedroom for the same price.
And he's not wrong. House prices here went up about $553 per day in the March quarter. And for renters in the Brizzy area, it's hard to find a home at all, with February's vacancy rate hitting less than 1%.
As the population increases, we know housing is becoming an issue. But what about the jobs? In Queensland, they're expecting around 280,000 new jobs by 2025. Most will be in health and social services, followed by accommodation, food services and retail.
I mean, it would be great to see things like increased manufacturing. Queensland's never been a big manufacturing state, but I think, you know, the impacts of the pandemic have shown a need to actually make things.
But right now, the Queensland government's focus is on attracting tradies. The state's shortage became particularly evident as communities began the rebuild after the recent flooding. Yet only 211 out of the 1,000 potential workers have taken up the $1,700 incentive to come here for a couple of months.
If you're living in another state, we want you to come to Queensland. We want you to run to paradise, to come to paradise.
This pitch didn't attract John. He's never heard of it. But he was already transferring through his job in the construction industry. So does he think he ran to paradise?
I am enjoying it. It's very beautiful. Even just getting to know a different city is pretty amazing. But yeah, parts of Queensland, definitely paradise.
So let's start with you, Sally. You're a case in point. Where are you from and why are you here?
Well, we're from Melbourne. I grew up in regional Victoria and moved to Melbourne because that's where my husband was and that's where the work was, that's where the uni was. Uni came a long time before the husband, but that's where we were based. We loved Melbourne, but I always wanted to try something else, maybe a country town. I was very tempted by the country. But at the start of COVID, probably 2 days into lockdown in Melbourne, my husband, we had two little children, so a 1-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, nearly 3-year-old. And my husband was the sole provider at the time for our family in that traditional structure. And he had a large-scale food manufacturer which supplied cafes and catering and organising. And I'm really proud of him because he said probably day 2 in the lockdown, I cannot compete with a global pandemic, and he made the decision to walk away. So closed the factory doors and walked away with nothing. And we had a talk and we thought, well, if it wasn't for COVID, there's no COVID silver lining at all. But if it wasn't for COVID, we wouldn't be in this decision-making period.
Yeah.
So I said to him, what do you want to do? He loves cricket. He's played cricket all his life. He's coached. He said, I want to be a professional cricket coach. So I was like, let's do it. So in lockdown, we've got an online business as well. So I spent the time trying to ramp that up because everyone was shopping online. And he retrained and did all of his certification for cricket coaching, which is very detailed, and working with children. And he was really passionate about working with young people and a love of cricket. And he emailed, like a cold call, but emailed every cricket school.
Wow.
And said, this is who I am. I want to work with you. I will work for free. And one cricket school in the Gold Coast emailed back and said, I've got 8 hours a week for you. So we packed everything up,
Wow.
kids,
Just on
house,
Wow.
for 8 hours, and we came up. And we are so pleased we did. Even if some people eye roll and think, oh, these Victorians coming up and taking over everything. But we made the decision because everyone comes to Queensland and they say, oh my God, this is such an amazing place. Why don't we live here? Why do we only come here on holidays? Well, we thought, well, let's do it. Instead of just saying, come here on holidays, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. Wes, it's interesting that you see a lot of Southerners. Do you like how I'm talking like
I know,
a local
yeah,
man?
you've
See what
positioned
I'm saying?
yourself.
You see a lot of Southerners come up to the Golden Sunshine Coast and to other parts of Queensland. You see a lot of Brisbane people coming home.
Yeah.
And you've come home not to Brisbane but to Minjerribah, to North Stradbroke.
Yeah. Well, I finished up at the Sydney Festival and I kind of went, what am I going to do? What's the kind of, what makes me feel comfortable? And coming back home, I mean, there's this thing about feeling comfortable about the weather as well. I mean, some people say, oh, the humidity, whatever, but it's what you grow up with and what you know. And things grow in Queensland, you know? People grow, gardens grow, businesses grow, everything grows here. So there's this part of me that just goes, why turn your back on this history, this knowledge of this particular place? And being back on North Stradbroke Island is amazing. I have turned into a gardener that I've never been before. And things are so fecund. Everything just kind of bursts out of the ground. And being on country is such an important part for me. Like being Quandamooka people, getting involved in local politics is fun. You know, family politics is fun. But also this idea of those who have gone away and have developed skills and knowledges and stuff, coming home, Brisbane's a very different place to what it was in the 80s. And when I say to some Southerners, they go, oh, Queensland, oh, do you even read a book there and all that kind of stuff? You start to go, actually, sometimes their attitudes of Queensland are 40 years old. They think we're still living under Joe Bjelke-Petersen years. And, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, Pauline Hanson doesn't help, you know, or Clive Palmer doesn't help that to change that narrative. But it's a very sophisticated city and its cultural life being a very outdoor city, I think makes it very Australian as well.
Yeah. Interestingly, Jackie, you were the infrastructure minister. Do you take a sharp intake of breath when you hear those numbers, 1 million people coming in 5 years, houses, roads, schools, the whole lot?
I was also planning minister, so infrastructure, transport planning, all of these are essential ingredients in terms of planning for that population growth. In fact, with the councils of South East Queensland, as Greg would know, we delivered a South East Queensland regional plan that had a 50-year vision. And I think it's safe to say that no one, at the time, we didn't predict COVID, we didn't predict some of those impacts that would have a big migratory pull up to Queensland.
And in fact, you know, in 2019, we were talking about Melbourne. This was happening in Melbourne. Whatever it was, a school a week, a school a month, they were having to build in Melbourne. But the movement has transferred up to here. So to what extent is there a bit of a scramble to catch up, as we saw with the, you know, Run to Paradise, trying to get tradies up here, not only to build the houses for the, whatever it is, 280,000 people who are going to come into jobs in this place in the next 5 years, but to repair after the floods.
Yeah, but this isn't just based on the migration into Queensland. It's also based on the fact that we've had historically low interest rates. People have not been able to travel, so they're using their disposable income around house renovations. So what you've got is a system that's already been locked and loaded into a particular work pattern. Then you've had people migrate up to Queensland. So there's a real pressure on the system because of a whole range of factors, not just population growth, but that is certainly something that has accelerated the issue.
And Greg, put on your former CEO of the Local Government Association Queensland hat. Think about all the LGAs. Just tell me quickly, who's seeing the growth? Where are you seeing the growth?
Well, this time round, first time in 30 or 40 years, it's the regions. They've got the strongest growth, believe it or not, greater than SEQ. So if you talk about places like the Fraser Coast, so Hervey Bay, that part of the world, sort of the Capricorn Coast, the coastal areas around Agnes and Agnes Waters 1770.
Way up north.
Way up north. And indeed, first-hand experience of talking to mayors in places like St George and Ewenden and Richmond, they've got new families, even if it's 3 or 4 coming to their towns, and they haven't got the housing stock. It's either run down, derelict, or doesn't exist. So this is statewide. It's probably been at least 20, 25 years since we've seen this influence. The tap's been turned back on, and this mass migration throughout Queensland's occurring.
Isn't that extraordinary? Before we move on, this perspective of Brisbane, courtesy of comedian Jimmy Reese.
Oh, hello there, Brisbane. Let's see what you got here. Oh, no shoes, a gurney and a shovel, active wear you don't get active in, but do sweat in, a wide-brim brown hat that's the same colour as the river, sunscreen, the inability to merge into traffic, left and right indicators. What's the point if you don't use them? An esky, a very large fan, a case of Forex, small flex to your Melbourne friends about the weather, a jumper you bust out when it dips below 25 degrees, giant eye roll at people who've moved up from down south even though you're originally from Victoria.
Just by chance this week, we've seen the release of 3 big reports, each of them entirely unconnected but vital to the future of this state. Now, between them, they outline the threats to Brisbane's economy, to its climate, and to the trust in the city's institutions. So let's start with the Brisbane City Council's flood report. You'll remember in the final days of February this year, there was an unprecedented rainfall event. About 80% of Brisbane's yearly average rainfall fell in 5 days. More than 23,000 properties were affected by the floods. Now, the council has conceded that there were unreasonable delays in information getting out and will prioritise upgrading its early warning system. The city's Lord Mayor has also said that the predictions by the Bureau of Meteorology were, quote, undercooked. And the report itself offered this evidence. In orange is the Bureau of Meteorology's maximum predicted rainfall. The purple is the actual maximum rainfall, which, as you can see over those key dates, the forecasted level was far below what ended up falling from the sky. The Drum has approached the Bureau for comment on the flood report, which was released 2 days ago, but they were unable to provide a response. Let me start with you, if I can, Jackie, on this one. Just take us through what this flood was like, because every flood is so different. 2011, do you remember? It was blue skies. The rain fell over the catchment, and as you're putting your arms, this river just up it came on a sunny day. What was this February like?
Well, this February it was just total inundation. Like the Friday and the Sunday, it was just like a curtain of rain fell the entire day, like a curtain of rain uninterrupted. It was something I had never seen before, but Then, because the ground was so wet and Wivenhoe had to have releases, then we started seeing the flooding take effect. So it was, I think, unlike 2011, where we did have warnings, where there was a lot of conversation happening, what we had was just inundation that we were, like I was trying to make sense of, people were trying to make sense of it.
And that's a really interesting distinction. In 2011, the rain fell in the catchment. Yep. And so there was, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Ignore and that was the big thing for the government to get across to people. Yep. Just ignore the blue sky. There is a flood coming. And this time, I think the report is suggesting there's 38 creeks in Brisbane. And those were right up high long before the river flooding system.
But also, to be fair, in 2011, we had a weather system that had raged through the regions all that summer as well. So what we had, by the time it hit Brisbane and the upper Brisbane catchment system, it had already raged through the regions. And the regions like Rockhampton had been flooded, Roma, a whole range of places throughout the regions had already been flooded. So we were on alert. I think what happened in February this year was a Brisbane-specific event.
Greg, you and I were talking earlier. It's really important to make the point that an enormous amount of work was done in Queensland in terms of flood mapping, some of which hadn't been done for a century after that event. The establishment of the Reconstruction Authority, which at the time and probably still is a nation-beating,
world-class
organisation for mitigation and immediately disaster relief. But let's look at what De Jersey, the report author, said. He said, look, not every one of those 38 creeks has got rain gauges in it, and the Bureau of Meteorology is relying on council to find out what's happening with the creeks. So there are kind of cracks in the system. There were also comments about the emergency alert system, that council's got to talk to the state government, who's got to talk to the Foreign Emergency Service before they put out the alert and so on.
Look, it's an issue that was first raised by Justice Holmes when she brought down her eponymous report in 2012 on the 11 floods, and it's been resaid essentially by De Jersey. Time is everything in these situations. If you're on the eastern side of the Great Divide, and particularly when the Great Divide's close to the coast, these rivers and creeks are very fast running. Time is everything. There's no amount of money, no engineering we can do to save people, save property in that situation. But time is critical to get people out and to save those lives.
Can I just make the point? What you're saying is, if you've got rain falling, and you've got and you're on a floodplain, and it's very close to the mountains, the water just rages.
It does. I mean, if you think back to Grantham, it was 8 inches in half an hour. You had an area width-wise of 1.2 kilometres travelling at 60k an hour. Now, that's hard to get your head around. We all talk about 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, but the true sense of the word force majeure, an act of God, comes to mind in these situations. You can't contemplate that. It's just not possible. So what do? You give people the maximum time to get in the car or find a way to higher ground so they're saved. And look, there are some big issues across the state, not just Brisbane, with the interaction with the bomb. We've said for a long time, I've said in my previous life, it's underfunded, and we need really strong protocols around how we decide how flooding is going to occur in towns like Rockhampton and Mackay. It was only 4 years ago that 40,000 people, which is a fair whack, just under half of the city of Mackay was evacuated to high ground, and that was in dispute. Equally, when Townsville had the 2019 floods, it was right, I was actually in the room with the mayor at the time, it was right down to the wire whether they'd have accurate information to decide whether they were going to flood 5,000 houses at the risk of having 15,000 people seriously impacted by the flood.
Just on the Bureau, I mean, they have said we've struggled to get, they can't give us a statement today about this report. And the report notes things like, on the 27th of February, the river flood warnings, there were 5 changes over 11 hours. I mean, there's a rapidly changing situation, right? That has to be acknowledged. But they say they have significant support from government. So what exactly are you saying? I mean, there's not the gauges in all these creeks.
No.
And De Jersey's saying, well, maybe there should be. The Bureau's waiting on the council. And you guys were speaking earlier about there's people who go out in tinnies to go and take the rain gauge.
Yep. Yeah, we've sat in the same room and we've
80-year-olds.
Relied on an 80-year-old to go out in his tinny in close to St George, take a reading and then ring it into the Bureau of Meteorology, and the people
on the landline.
People decide whether we're going to evacuate a town of 1,500. That's literally the state of play. Now, local government spent best part of 40 million after 211 with telemetry, radar and rivers, all sorts of things. But it is this interaction that the Jersey goes to between the Bureau of Meteorology and councils, how we collect the data, that there's one point of truth, we don't get confused about what we're looking at, and it's very quick. And we need to know that wherever you are in the state, you're going to get that level of service. So that's the task in front of us. We've got to really work together, and Canberra's got a big role to play in this, making sure that we have an architecture for the whole state, that we have a standard of service and equipment that's up to the challenge, and we can get that information to the people within half an hour to an hour, because that's often all you've got to get people out of harm's way.
And Wes, just interestingly on this, there's a couple of conflicting elements of the report. On one hand, Council has this Weather Zone app, which will push out alerts to you about what's going on, but only 14% of people in Brisbane have it. On the other hand, more than 10,000 volunteers for the Mud Army never got going because community did it. They were ready to go. So on one hand, really prepared, and the other hand, they haven't got the app.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. After 2011 too, I think there's the idea of community responsibility and getting involved, but how do you actually, as an individual, look after yourself as well is going to be very important. What I love about Brisbane and in these kind of circumstances, and we don't have the monopoly on it, but there is a sense of if there's a problem, you get in there and you sort it out. And you don't have to rely on others. I think there's a strong kind of sense of looking after yourself. And that I think there's a suspicion around apps, suspicion around who's got your information and who's going on there. And I think that could be playing out along the way as well. I don't know that for truth, but I know my family, no one wants to give their information to anything that looks a bit like a government kind of app or authority. So the sense of relying on your community is so much more important.
Interesting. Another report released this week by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has found that 91% of reefs surveyed this year showed signs of bleaching. This would be the fourth mass bleaching event over the past 7 years. The aerial survey swept 2,300 kilometres, finding the worst bleaching between Cape Tribulation and the Whitsundays, which are almost the most visited tourist spots in the marine park. Last year, scientific advisors at UNESCO recommended the reef be listed as in danger, but after the Environment Minister campaigned hard against that, the listing was deferred. 3 years ago, at the Liberal Party campaign launch, Scott Morrison credited his government for, quote, saving the Great Barrier Reef.
We have saved the Great Barrier Reef. Well done to Greg Hunt, particularly, on his work when he was Environment Minister, taking it off the endangered list. And we've invested record funding in researching and protecting its future, thanks to Josh's time as Environment Minister.
You've worked in politics. You worked for Tony Abbott, I think, at one stage in a political career, and you've been in the structure of the National Party. And now you do. You were talking to us about doing drop-off with other mums and dads on the Gold Coast, and with people going, oh, election, who could be bothered? What do you make of that? Of, you know, the Prime... Oh, dear. Huge round of applause for my question. What do you make of that when the Prime Minister says 3 years ago, we've saved the Great Barrier Reef, and since then we've seen UNESCO saying, boy, it's in trouble, and now we've got a report 91% bleached?
I really think it's coming back. Every conversation we've had in the last week around the election is people talking about cost of living, petrol prices. It's a really long bow for someone who's under mortgage stress, under rental stress. I think in many regions, in many of the coalition base, to think, well, what's happening in the Whitsundays? That's just for tourists. You know, you said that that stretch is the most visited. And I think, though, that's changing, and we're changing that with the rise of independents across the electorates, who a lot of them are funded by Climate 200, who are saying out and saying that I care about the climate and I care what's going on. But I think there is a real misperception around Conservative voters that they don't care about the environment, and I think that's incorrect. And I think if you look at the base, and particularly a National Party base, we talk about the Great Barrier Reef, and I feel very strongly, and personally very strongly, about the health of the Great Barrier Reef, because I've got young children, I care about the environment. It makes me quite a moderate Conservative. But equally, we've got something like the Murray-Darling Basin, which crosses 3 states of our country, massive swathes of land, massive community, and a massive environmental impact. And we're not talking about that. So does that come back to the problem around what's being spoken about in the media or what's being spoken about on social media, that, you know, we're focused, and I'm not negating the Great Barrier Reef at all, but we're focused. That's something that's exciting to talk about and it's a soundbite. But what about all of the other things that we need to consider as a community, in our own local communities, in our own homes?
Jackie, can I go to you? It's extraordinary to go back to the last campaign launch. The Prime Minister says we've saved the Great Barrier Reef, and in the interim, as I say, we've seen UNESCO say we need to list this as endangered. Australia pushed back very hard against that, and now we have this report, the release of which I think was delayed a little bit because there was some concern that the release of it would breach caretaker conventions once the election was called. Your reflections on all of that?
Well, Ellen, as a senior Queensland government minister who travelled to UNESCO in 2015 to argue against the listing of the Great Barrier Reef on the in danger UNESCO listing, at the time I understood that UNESCO took the decision in large part because the Queensland government came into power on a suite of policies that would deal with water quality, containing port development along the Great Barrier Reef, prohibiting dredge spoil spill and acting on climate change. So there was a whole suite of policies there. And I went with Greg Hunt at the time, who was the Environment Minister, and we pledged to do this. Now, I am concerned, as I think most Australians are, to see the constant bleaching effect of climate change and ocean acidification on the Great Barrier Reef. And I think that Sally makes some good points, but something I will, with respect, take issue with is saying that this is a niche issue. It's not a niche issue. The Murray-Darling Basin is not a niche issue. The protection of our environment and ensuring that we're using resources not only for our economy and for jobs, which are critical, and the Great Barrier Reef actually does create so many thousands of jobs in this nation, that managing the environment for our economy responsibly, but also for the legacy, for the benefit it gives our nation and our children, that is critical and important. It's not niche, it's central from my perspective. So I think there's a lot of questions. I want to know what happened to the $400 million plus that was given to the Great Barrier Reef without a tender process by the Morrison, the foundation, without a tender process. What outcomes have we seen in the 3 years since that money has been given to that foundation? What benefit has been flown on? Is there enough money going to science to rehabilitate coral? I noticed from the media reports that some of the coral bleaching is not fatal. The coral is recovering. Can we accelerate this recovery? I know that Professor Tim Flannery has done some fantastic work around seaweed farming close to the Great Barrier Reef to drop ocean acidification. What are we doing in the innovation and science space to save the coral? That's something that we need to ask ourselves.
Well, the state government has kicked off a formal inquiry into cultural issues with the Queensland Police Force. The Women's Safety and Justice Report was delivered to the government at the end of last year, finding a widespread and negative culture in police undermined their efforts in this area. Originally, the Police Commissioner, Katarina Carroll, and the Police Union had been dismissive of the need for such an investigation, with the Union President Ian Levers describing the report as woke. But they were now cooperating with the inquiry. Wes, can I start with you? This is an interesting one. The terms of reference for this inquiry look at whether there are any cultural issues with the Queensland Police Service that negatively affect police investigations of domestic and family violence, and if there are any cultural issues, whether they have contributed to the overrepresentation of First Nations people in the criminal justice. You've got a brother who's a copper.
Yeah. And I think that, when he and I have a bit of a conversation, I know that he's exposed to some of the worst parts of our society, and his job is to protect them and the community from this kind of behaviour. And I think anything, I see him go, anything he can do to make the community safer, he will do. And it's that terrible kind of dilemma that he's often called in at the worst moments, you know, after something's occurred, rather than the kind of preventative moments. And let's say for a First Nations person, often we're talking about issues that stem from the effects of colonisation, and we're talking about the discrimination and prejudice and how they've formed in people's lives, and kind of people acting out against those things. And so what is the role of the police to control a community, to keep them safe? And it's a very hard job. I'm not here to you know, hit the police with a big stick. I actually think they're doing a really hard job. I think what we need to do is look at the preventative measures. We need to look at a much bigger conversation. And I think we should do anything we can to make women and families as safe as they can. And I think the police have to kind of take that on board. I think they do. And for me, I go, we often talk about these symptoms, these end products of something that we don't look at. What is the preventative measures? What are the source of these kind of disquiets in our community? And I think that racism and colonisation have really had an effect on our First Nations people. And we don't know necessarily how to change that. And we have for decades been saying, this is how we can do it. This is how we can do it. And just recently, the whole idea of a voice to Parliament going, actually, we can help you reshape the debate, reshape the conversation, and it gets dismissed so quickly. And for me, I go, yeah, you want to deal with police, you know, locking up people, but you don't want to actually deal with the cause of it all. And I want to deal with that more.
Sally, you grew up with domestic and family violence, and this report talks about the way in which victims are let down, and the way in which sometimes police and authorities misunderstand who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, with kind of disastrous consequences. Do you want to share what your experience was?
Of course, and I agree. I really support the work of police. I think particularly community policing, particularly policing that's done in rural and regional communities. I grew up in a wonderful, tiny rural community, not even nowhere near a regional level. And we had family issues, and I think just after Mother's Day it's so important to be speaking about this, because if 1 in 6 mothers or 1 in 6 women experience intimate abuse, Mother's Day, we should have been shouting this from the rooftops, not just talking about flowers and breakfast in bed. We should be talking about the issues that really affect women and men, because I know that intimate and domestic violence happens from both sexes. But in a rural or a tiny little community, there might not be a police person in that community. It might be 21 kilometres away. It might be 50 kilometres away. They're a long phone call away. And equally, they might be really, well, in a small country town where, you know, the police person might play a sport with a perpetrator, or because there's very little opportunities for formal socialising, they might be drinking at the pub on a Friday night with the perpetrator, who then goes home and commits these acts of violence.
And was that your experience?
Well, our experience is that we had an intervention order against my father, and my father was a farmer, and so he had weapons and firearms because he used them on the farm to control pests and rodents. So part of the orders was that he had no firearms. And the local police person went and visited and served the orders and said, you know, it came back, and Mum's lawyer was told that he would keep firearms, my father would keep firearms because he needed them for his farm work. But they were still one of them was a high-powered hunting rifle.
And did that make you afraid as a child, as a teenager?
I was 14, I was afraid. I think my mother was really afraid. And the other thing is that a lot of people will see this, and I come from a small country town, they'll be very proud that I'm on TV. There will be people watching it and they think, but what a great bloke he was. And it's something that we don't speak about openly, but there was fear in my household growing up, and there was fear from my mother, who knew that the police person was a friend of the families, so what action would be taken. And that was 30 years ago, but things have not changed. It is still hard to be a rural police person, I think. The pressures are so great. And there's also the society and the cultural and the friendship and the social pressures as well. So unfortunately, I know this is still happening in small country towns, and we know that's happening in 1 in 6 households. So it's important to speak about.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. Yeah.
Pleasure.
There was a third debate between Mr Albanese and Mr Morrison last night. The pundits variously described them as nervous, civil, and that it was essentially a draw. Cost of living, as Sally has said, the buzz phrase, with the mince and steak argument pushed by the opposition leader, and economic competence pitch from the Prime Minister.
What sort of pay rise do workers deserve?
If you just say 5.1%, that puts Australia's economy at great risk.
If the increase is less than the inflation rate, they'll be getting a real wage cut.
The Fair Work Commission is the right place to do that because the economy needs stability and it needs certainty.
They deserve better than that.
What are you going to do to ensure that families can make ends meet?
Our measures on childcare, for example.
We cut fuel tax in half.
When your youngest child goes into kindergarten, all of a sudden families are better off.
$250 to pensioners and others on fixed incomes.
Our energy policy will reduce electricity prices by $275.
Increased tax relief from the 1st of July.
You are smashing out those talking points. When will you bring your bill for an integrity commission before the Parliament?
If we can ensure that our bill can be passed, then I'm very happy to bring it forward.
This is the most wasteful government in Australia's history.
This is a Labor leader who comes from the far left of the party.
Waste and rorts is something that has characterised this government.
He's a loose unit when it comes to the economy.
Surely everybody has one redeeming feature, don't they?
The thing about Anthony that I've always admired is that he's never forgot where he's come from.
Scott's absolutely committed to his nation, and I admire that.
But, you know, to do this job, you need to know your stuff. You need to be across the detail.
There you go, you can be positive.
I must have misunderstood the question.
Greg, that was the highlights package. I think that was that's probably the best way to watch it for a lot of people. There's been a bit of debate around this idea of Anthony Albanese backing a 5.1% pay increase that I think works out for those being paid $20.33 at about $1.03 an hour. And we see employer groups saying that they're okay with a pay increase between 2.5% to 3.7%, but there's a suggestion that Mr Albanese is being irresponsible in pushing that and it could have an inflationary effect. How does that sound to Queensland-ears?
I think it's really, towards the end of the campaign, a breakthrough issue. When Labor's come to power in Australia, it's always had a big central issue, whether it was Whitlam or Hawke or Rudd. In Rudd's case, people always talk about Kevin 07, but they forget work choices. A lot of what happened was a reaction to work choices. That element wasn't apparent in this campaign.
And that was an issue about industrial relation. Absolutely. And how secure your employment was.
And if you think about Queensland, where the coalition has 24 of the 30 seats, and probably will certainly have at least 20 or more after the election, for them, the Labor Party to break through, and particularly in the regions where they are still fairly industrialised, it's either Australian Workers Union or the industrial left, I would call it, out of the sugar mills and manufacturing, or in the outer burbs around southeast Queensland, that will bite. I mean, the fact that it's been made binary, where Albanese has said, Prime Minister, are you saying people will have to get further behind because they can't have a pay rise that matches inflation? That is a very difficult proposition for Morrison to back. So I think the last week it'll be critical in people's minds as they switch on that, you know, my standard of living, the cost of living, and a one-off cost of CPI rise in wages is a fundamental issue to a lot of people.
Oh, so you think it's a breakthrough issue?
I do. I mean, it's not going to mean that suddenly Labor wins 15 seats in Queensland, but I do think that they weren't able to break through. I couldn't see the issue. There was annoyance. There were people who were grumpy with the Prime Minister and various other issues, but I couldn't see that issue. I believe he's crystallised it. Whether it was purposeful or it happened at this time, it is one of those issues people will be talking about in the pubs and the clubs and around coffee tables.
Jackie, the newspapers are saying that there's a prospect that even though Labor only holds, 6 out of 30 seats in Queensland, that it may not pick up any more. Federal Labor may finish this election still without a seat outside the southeast of the state.
Well, this is all commentary, and as Sally knows, there's a hell of a lot of commentary that happens in the lead up to polling day.
But what are you hearing?
But, well, I'm hearing that there's a lot of tight contests in Queensland, not just in southeast Queensland, but outside the southeast Queensland corner. You know, there are some,
like beyond Leichhardt, based on Cairns, beyond Flynn.
Well, Leichhardt is one. Flynn obviously is another.
Bundaberg, is it? Yeah.
So, you know, and Bundaberg, what you've got is an ex-LNP person running as an independent in Hinkler, sorry. So, you know, there are some tight competitions here. But I think Greg is absolutely correct around the cost of living issue and wage growth. And picking up on Sally's point before, this is no longer an esoteric conversation. We've had interest rate increases in the last week. People are not just feeling like they can't keep up, they're actually doing the calculations now around mortgage repayments and what happens if their pay packet doesn't keep up. Like, people are actually doing these calculations now, so it's no longer an esoteric argument, and they are looking at the leaders around who will actually guarantee that they don't continue to fall behind. And Albanese is the only leader at this election who actually has a plan or actually has a commitment, a policy and philosophical commitment to Australian workers not to let them fall behind.
And we will come to Sally's views on that. She may well have a different view. But first, can I go to you, Wes? Teal is not a colour in Queensland.
No.
There's no teal independent. You're all laughing. You're all laughing. Look at you all going, David, no.
There's a lot of yellow.
Yeah.
There's not sunshine
Get behind me,
but there's a lot of yellow.
Right.
You know, but also the UAP, also First Nation. I mean, that's where it's heartland is here as well, I think. So, you know, when people also talk about the Greens as a kind of big force, you go, well, in some seats, yeah, sure, Greens are a big force.
But that's the only choice. If if teal is a combination of the colours blue and green, the only choice in the inner city here, it would seem, for the two seats that are in play, it would seem Brisbane and Ryan, both held by the LNP, would be kind of the king-making vote of the Greens. That would be the choice, rather than, I mean, that would be the alternate choice to Liberal and Labor, as opposed to in southern states you've got this teal choice.
Agreed. And I think that
but why not here?
Oh, I don't
why
know.
are you laughing, all of you?
Well, I don't know about other people might have a better opinion. I don't think that's the teal independent for me. Has seemed to be against the Liberals, been very strongly kind of against the Liberal position, mostly around climate change, mostly around, and I think that Labor in Queensland in particular has been very strong on the kind of climate change action and things on a state level. So I think that there's not been a kind of, I'm conflating things now, that the state and the federal politics haven't landed in such a way that a teal is the most important thing.
That's a funny analysis, though, because in New South Wales they've done extraordinary. I mean, they've got an extraordinary consensus on dealing with you know, getting renewables into the energy system and closing coal-fired power stations. And yet you can't go to the supermarket without running into a teal candidate. You know.
I think and I think Queenslanders, we love to have one party in the state and another party in the feds, and so we love that kind of competition has been there for a very long time. So the Teals haven't the independents have been part of that, and I think a lot of that independent energy has gone to One Nation and the UAP. I mean, you drive down through Cleveland and stuff where I am now, and all those massive yellow billboards promising things I don't even know what they mean, promising things that make no sense, about house and or what does freedom even mean?
Right.
So I think that's where a lot of that kind of independent feel has gone.
And Sally, former State Director of the Victorian National Party, so put that hat on for me. And I saw
will.
that Cathy McGowan, the kind of this generation's original
independent the
Conservative, in a rural area, has said, look, the LNP, National Party, Liberal Party down south, have kind of mishandled this in the sense that there's a perception that the Teals in the country areas, who may not be supported by Climate 200, Simon Holmes Accord, are actually community people. It's a community movement, and that demonising them has been the wrong response. What's your view of that?
I feel really strongly that politics is personal and politics is local, and I've had the great benefit and joy of working in these regional communities and seeing how active and engaged they are in their politics and in their local politics. So I don't think we can ever underestimate a good local candidate who has good local connections and has a real passion and a fire for their own local community.
And so, do you think they're fakes and stooges and anti-Liberal groupies?
Look, I'm sure that there are some fakes and stooges and anti-Liberal groupies, but I'm sure that's not the case for all of them. That's a broad brush to paint. I've also dealt with a lot of independents over the years and can see some real power in independence, but I have to say I do worry what will happen if there's a big group of, because anyone who's been in a parliament situation knows how hard it is to get an I on top of a dot on top of an I, or a T on top, a cross on top of the T. It's almost as difficult as that sentence was to say. It's more difficult than that.
But the National Party who make that difficult for the Liberal Party, and don't they see that as their job? I mean, that's just how coalitions work. Any coalition's fractious. We could talk to Jackie about the factions in the Labor Party. It's fractious, right? What's the difference?
I think there's still a lot of soft votes, even with 9 sleeps to go until an election. There is still a lot of softness around the areas, and an hour, as we know, is a long... People say a day's a long time in politics. Don't give me a day, give me an hour and things can change like that. I think that, you know, I wonder about policy and how policy's costed, and if you say you're going to do this, if you say you're going to do housing loans for 4%, how are you going to do that? What are you going to do? That's a UAP, not a
Is
TIL.
this a conversation you're having on the Gold Coast? Do people want to have this conversation with you in this election?
Well, I think the Gold Coast, I always say this because
in community, put it that
because
way.
I came from Victoria, Victoria is a coalition that is a very different structure from the LNP. And they are almost worlds apart in many regards, in structure regards and in agreement regards. And so it's very different. So in somewhere like Goldstein or somewhere like Indi, which where Kathy was and where Bridget, I know that she's reacting to some comments that Bridget McKenzie made, and independence, there's a strong tradition of people in their communities putting up their hands and saying enough is enough, or I want to see change. Very different, I think, to here, because as you said, we in Queensland, we've got Palmer United, we've got First Nations, so there's a very different history of independence here. I'm not hearing about it in the school drop-off at this stage.
They want to talk about it at all?
No one wants to talk about it. People are fatigued, and I think that's where the soft votes come from. On the back of a global pandemic, there has been so much change and shift and trauma and angst, and so many people watching media press conferences, like their daily press conference, that would never have watched a political press conference. People are fatigued. They're fatigued about the debates. They're fatigued about, oh my God, that's why pre-polling's so high, is because people don't want to go and get their democracy sausage. I want my democracy sausage. I want to feel the vibe on the day, but think people are fatigued.
Well, on Sunday next week, we should know who our Prime Minister will be and which MPs will be representing us. But what might take a little longer to know is the result of the Senate race, which we'll also be voting on next week. The Drumscarter Ali explains how the voting for the Senate will work this time and why it's equally as important as the House of Reps.
Over the last few weeks, there has been a lot of talk of who our Prime Minister might be or who will win what seat. But it can be easy to forget that we're also voting for the Senate. The Senate is the House of the States and acts as a check on government, scrutinising bills, government administration and government policy in general. At the moment, no one party has a majority in the Senate, so sometimes deals have to be made with other parties to get things over the line. In this election, alongside the House of Representatives, there will be a half Senate election. This means 6 of the 12 senators who represent each state, and both from the ACT and Northern Territory, are up for election. Before 2016, you used to be able to just vote one above the line, and if you did, your preference would be decided for you by the group that you voted for, usually after political parties had struck deals with one another, but now it's up to you. This time you can either number at least 6 boxes from 1 to 6 above the line for parties or groups, or number at least a dozen from 1 to 12 below the line for individual candidates. But most people vote above the line. To win a Senate spot, a candidate must reach a certain number of votes, or a quota. For example, if Party A wins enough votes in Queensland to fill 3 quotas, that's 3 Senate seats. After the primary votes are counted, preferences are distributed to work out who has the most support to fill the quotas that are left. This distribution is complicated and can get candidates into the Senate even if they don't meet the quota from primary votes. Here's how it works. If your preferred candidate gets more votes than they need to be elected and there are still spots up for grabs, those extra votes will be redistributed to other candidates according to how you've numbered your ballot. If there are still spots to fill, then the candidate with the fewest votes at each stage of the count gets eliminated, with the votes for them transferred to the next candidate you've numbered. This redistribution keeps happening until all spots are filled. So a candidate could ride on a wave of redistribution till they get a spot. Counting for the Senate takes longer than the House of Representatives, so it will take weeks before all senators are declared elected.
OK, Jackie, this is interesting. The 6th Senate spot in Queensland is one of the wonders of the world, the natural world. Perhaps the most interesting contest.
Should be on the endangered list.
You think? So it's a contest between the LNP might pick up a 3rd Senate spot, but she's up against Pauline Hanson, Clive Palmer and the former LNP Premier Campbell Newman, who did an interview on Rockhampton Radio the other day urging people to vote for him, even though he acknowledged openly people did not like him.
Yep.
What will happen?
Well, I think it's going to be a dog's breakfast, that 6th position. I mean, I think that it will come down to, I think, the essentially the flow-through of preferences. And we've seen how you've got preference whisperers in the past and particular modelling that has been done in order to advantage smaller parties. Like, I don't know that this has happened, but I'll put UAP up there. Obviously, Clive Palmer has been very public and vocal about his support for Campbell Newman. So there's no doubt that there will be some electoral flow through there to Campbell Newman. So it's going to be interesting to see. I don't think that our state or our nation, and I come to this with bias perspective, will be well suited or well served by Campbell Newman in the Senate. I think we saw the damage that he did in Queensland when he ruthlessly sacked so many workers and ground our economy down. And quite frankly, I don't think he deserves a second chance in the Australian Senate.
Would you prefer Pauline, Clive or the LNP?
Well, Labor's running quite a few. Look, it's going to be interesting to see, but I share Greg's analysis. It will take a long time to determine that final 6th position.
Yeah. Greg, we're nearly out of time. It's interesting. What happens? We started the program talking about 1 million people coming to Southerners, bloody Southerners, yeah? Coming to Brisbane, coming to South East Queensland, right over the state in the next 5 years. Does Queensland change the Southerners, or do the Southerners change Queensland politically?
I think because of what Wes had said before about the history, the geography, the climate, we change the Southerners. I mean, that's my long experience. I've been one of those people that left in the 80s as part of the diaspora that left and then came back in the 90s. I think the Queensland position is different. Our history, our geography, the fact we've got 10 provincial cities with more than 100,000 people, it's hard to get people from other parts of Australia to understand that. And it throws up these big characters. It's not just now. I mean, Queensland's the only state that's ever had a properly elected communist member of parliament. Right. In Bowen, Fred Patterson. So look, it's that sort of place. I mean, these larger-than-life bobcatters. I think some of the mayors that are running this time round for the federal seats in Andrew Wilcox in Dawson and Matty Burnett in Flynn, they bring that with them. People know them. They know their values. They know their track record. It's that sort of place. The bigger, the better. If you've got half a missing ear or you've had a bit of bark knocked off you, that makes you just like us. So I think it's the sort of place that if you've got profile, if you've got character and that you stand for something, then people are more than likely you're going to say, oh, yeah, I'll vote for him or her.
Why not? Final word, Wes. How do migrants to this place, and take this, today, last year, post-pandemic, way back at first contact, colonisation, invasion, become infused with the sense of history and place that's here?
How do they do it? I mean, I think too, just the idea that we only have one House of Parliament in the state means something very different, and it's history. Why do we only have one? We don't have an upper house. And how do we actually talk about who we are, where we are? And we're not scared of a good old kind of protest vote too. Okay. If we're going to slap someone down, you can feel us all kind of pile on because we go, oh yeah, no. And so you get this kind of sense of the Campbell Newman wave in and wave out.
Yes.
Because you go, that's the nature of who we are and the way we debate and discuss things. We're all or nothing, I think. All or nothing.
Wonderful discussion today. If you've been affected by anything we've been discussing in the show tonight, call Lifeline 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT, 1800 737 730. That's all we have time for tonight. Thanks so much to our panel, to Wes, to Sally, Greg and Jackie Trad's in as well. Catherine Robinson's with you tomorrow night. Have a wonderful evening. Stay dry.